Welcome back. We're about to start the second session. Please take your seats. Before I have the Sergeant of Arms remove you. Welcome back for our second session. Hamilton versus Jefferson. This second session is entitled Freedom. Seems to me that freedom never stands alone, though, so my first question is a very general question. What's the relationship of law to freedom? In looking over the readings for this session, I've sort of grouped them because last time there were a few documents that got short shrift, and so I thought maybe grouping them would allow us to have a broader discussion and make sure we touched on as many of the articles as the panelists want to. First is law, a couple of things that Hamilton wrote. One, before the Revolution, in which he expresses concern about the abuse to a loyalist newspaper publisher. Second one, after the Revolution, he expresses concern about the way New York State is misusing the law to seize the property and maybe the persons of loyalists. We have a couple of items dealing with religious freedom. Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom, and his letter to the Danbury Baptists. We have Hamilton reflecting on the need to protect executive power in his Pacificus paper, and we have Hamilton on the need to protect judicial power in his paper, The Examination. And we have a lot on slavery, which is where I think maybe we should start this session. So the items that we have that touch on slavery are sort of in chronological order. Hamilton's letter dealing with possible recruitment of emancipation and recruitment of former slaves into the forces fighting the British. We have Jefferson's, a brief section from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia dealing with manners, which I think is important and might be worth reading a little of if I can find it here. I'll tell you what I'm interested in this. He gives this compelling description of what happens to slaves under slavery and what happens to masters under slavery, engaged in slavery. He says, our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. And I'll put this question out, and then I'll go on with my little list. Because we know that Jefferson was very cautious in moving politically on slavery, right? Things had to be right, time had to be right. We had to wait for God's word to move. But Jefferson was also a slave owner. If he understood, first of all, the way in which slavery injured both owners and slaves, and he understood that man was an imitative creature, why didn't he set an example? Just leave it at that. On that question, we can talk about the politics. Other letters, Santo Domingo, what should we do there? At various points, we're concerned about it may be inflaming North America. At other points, it may be the best place to put slaves from Virginia that the Virginia legislature wants to remove from their territory. And Santo Domingo is also connected with something we raised last time but didn't really talk about, and that's the Louisiana Purchase. So I'll just put the Louisiana Purchase back on the table for anybody who wants to talk about it. So let's just start with slavery. And finally, Santo Domingo, the interesting notes that Hamilton prepares for what I assume is a suggested constitution. So Hamilton and Jefferson on slavery. Who would like to begin? I can wait you out.
Questions about that from the audience?
Okay, John? John?
Yeah, I put on my Monticello hat. One of the documents that isn't here, and we grapple with this on a daily basis, but one of the critical documents that is not here is part of the notes. Jefferson is afraid, as are many of the Southern plantation owners. I mean, deep fear. And he talks about emancipation, and he says there's going to be a bloodbath. He says these people are going to kill us, and they're going to kill us because we deserve it. He knows of what he speaks. He knows what has been done to these people. He knows the justice would require blood for blood. And that fear, I think, drives so much of his thinking. And so that's why you have to have colonization. That's why you have to have dispersal. In fact, one of the great miracles of American history is that there wasn't more blood. I mean, we talk about the Civil War being blood, but that was mostly, that was not blood imposed primarily by African Americans against their former masters, which is what Jefferson feared. So I think one should start with that document that's not here, and that explains much of what he did and what he doesn't do on the issue.
Thanks, John, and let me encourage panelists. Bob was very restrained. The first conference discussion led for him, I think we had 600 pages. And so he was very restrained in putting this reader together, which means there was a lot left out. So this reader actually, as I was going through it, I was thinking of connect the dot games I used to play as a child, because there are lots of things, and you should feel free, as John did, to fill in with other documents that we haven't been included. Annette?
I think John is right. Fear is a predominant feeling that he has about the institution of slavery. It's important to keep in mind that slavery was not just one thing from 1619 to 1865. There were different eras, different understandings about the institution, different relationships between the people and people who were being enslaved and the people who were enslaving them. Jefferson did not grow up at a time when there was any kind of romantic notion about enslaved people as members of the family, the kind of Gone with the Wind or antebellum slavery that apologists for slavery put out. For most of his life, enslaved people were seen as utterly different, not a part of the family, people who were threats. And he certainly comes to realize their threats during the American Revolution, when many of them joined forces with the British in order to fight against the Americans and hoping to get their freedom. So he's seeing all of these things in terms of a wheel of fortune turning and the possibility that there could be a bloodbath. This relates to Saint-Domingue, Haiti, as well. When the first thing that I've read about him, when he's discussing Saint-Domingue, he's writing to his daughter, Patsy, or by then she's Martha because she's married, and he says, the Negro, I'm paraphrasing, the Negroes have taken over and it formed a government, which is basically what's going to happen in the Caribbean. He predicts that that's what's going to be the normal course of things. And that's pretty much it. Then he begins to hear stories about black people killing white people. And this whole matter changes for him. He begins to see the specter of something like that happening in Virginia. You remember that Virginia is 40% black at this time, so this is a real question. The issue of race, the issue of slavery, all of those things have to be seen in context, in the context of numbers. I mean, very often Adams and other people are compared to Jefferson on this particular question. And this is not by way of an excuse, but it's by way of trying to get yourself back into the time period that this individual is living in. And, you know, John Adams is not surrounded by 40% black people in Massachusetts. There is not, the whole understanding about race, about threat, about fear is driven by numbers. And one of the reasons that he is not hopeful about this is because he's tested the waters and he understands. St. George Tucker writes to him, and we have part of his response about his St. George Tucker's gradual emancipation plan. If I'm not mistaken, it's sometime off in the 20th century when the gradual emancipation would be totally effectuated. But the Virginia legislature is not hearing it at all. They won't accept it. And so he writes to Jefferson in complaint. And Jefferson says, well, you know, yes, that's the truth, but we've got to do something. And he's talking about it in terms of fear, the notion that people will, in fact, enact violence. And so this is part of his thinking. And the only way to do something about this is that the people of the community, this goes back to his notion of republicanism, the people of the community have to make the decision about this. Now, that's not satisfactory to me. It's not satisfactory to us. But when he's talking about manners and he's talking about what slavery does to individual people, he's thinking about this institution as a threat to the moral character of the people who would be Republican citizens. And so this whole notion of the people making decisions, of course he's talking about the white people of Virginia who are civically empowered, is critical for him. So if the public is not going to bear the cost. I mean, very often people say, well, you know, it was his job or other people's job to make people ready for that. But if people are not ready, no individual is going to do that. I mean, he could have been beating his head against the wall. He could have done the things that I and other people would like for him to have done, but the chances are we wouldn't be sitting here talking about him today because he would have been marginalized. We would have been a figure that we would write a book about and say how ahead of his time he was, and we would have congratulated him. But all the things that he wanted to do personally, the ambition that is seen by Hamilton and others, all of those other things that he wanted to do, he would not have been able to do. But the primary thing here is this notion that John is right, this notion of fear. And he takes seriously the possibility that something could happen. We're sitting and looking back, and we know that besides Nat Turner and other revolts and rebellions that were much smaller than that, we know what happened. We know what was possible and what was not possible, or not. We know what happened. He, at this moment, doesn't know what could happen. And we can say that the fear is unfounded, but it's not a crazy fear to think that there would be retaliation, that there would be hatred, and that there would be bloodshed. And that was his primary consideration.
Peter?
I think what's really important, what's important about all of this is that the slavery problem is not coincidental. It's not an add-on, and isn't it a shame that they didn't do something about it when they had the chance? It's absolutely central, and it has to be understood in terms of the revolutionary experience itself, as John and Annette have suggested. Fear is important, but of course it's fear that is predicated on aggregating the force of all enslaved people rather than controlling them, as historically was done throughout the history of slavery in North America and elsewhere, on a local basis within households, which are the functioning unit of production. Jefferson ramps it up. He's not saying, of course, we know that there are discontented slaves who will make problems. Everybody's experienced that. But the revelation that black people collectively might act against their white masters collectively, that was the insight that Jefferson and fellow revolutionaries gained in the middle of the war. So the idea, what they fear, is this emergent black nation. I mentioned earlier that what marks the emergence of the American people is a growing consciousness and awareness that white people have across the continent that they're a part of a common cause or enterprise. The American people emerges. In the same way the American people emerges at this time, the idea or the specter of a captive nation of black people emerges in the context of geopolitical struggle in which Americans find themselves struggling for independence against the British nation. The idea of the people is crucial, and that is racially inflected because of the particular circumstances of the Revolutionary War is extremely consequential for subsequent American history. What Annette anticipates correctly is a response to this idea of an alien people in our midst. Well, what would you do? You would domesticate that people. You would neutralize the threat. You'd buy it off if you could. You'd find ways to ameliorate, a key word of this period, to placate potentially insurgent slaves. You would indeed make them part of the family. In, of course, the way children are a part of the family, perpetually dependent. That's, imagine always being a college student forever, perpetually dependent. What a thought, huh? And that idea of the paternalistic relationship with enslaved people echoes, in fact, the way Jefferson says we used to think about slaves before the imperial crisis, before the Revolution, in a letter to Edward Coles, which again is not included as 20, 30, 40, 50 documents should be included. Just joking. It's a wonderful selection. But Coles says he says to Coles in 1814, back before the Revolution, we thought of our slaves as domestic animals. We didn't distinguish them from livestock. We knew they were human because we could communicate, and of course, if you can't communicate, you can't command and control, you can't get any real value. But that was the idea, domestic animals. And think of how paternalism comes full circle to that idea of domesticating human beings, now under the aegis of an expansive sentimental idea of family.
Somebody said that the perception of a threat to the white people from the slaves was new in the Revolution, but I want to piggyback on Peter's last comment there. I don't think that it was the perception of a threat that was new. After all, James Madison's grandfather, wasn't it, was killed by slaves on his plantation, and then at least one of those people was burned within sight of Montpelier, burned for killing James Madison's grandfather. People knew that the slaves were a threat. What was new to them at the time of the Revolution was that they thought there was something wrong with this, that they thought there was something wrong with holding them as slaves. So we have a feeling that, well, of course, people always perceived wrongness in holding slaves, but in general, the law of slavery was accepted, not much questioned, and this wasn't true only in, of course, the southern colonies, it was true in the other colonies. So what needs explanation, I think, at this point is that these people, in thinking through their claims about general rights of humans, are including their slaves in these claims. And Jefferson, for one, is trying to decide how he can square the circle of having, as Annette said, some kind of safety for the master class in the short run, that is the white people in the short run, while ultimately lifting the moral burden of slave owning from their shoulders in the long run. So again, I have a feeling, or it's my understanding, that it was the idea of the wrongness of slavery that was different here.
Carson.
Well, obviously, Jefferson was conflicted about slavery. Everybody knows that, and people here know a lot more about that than I do. I was just thinking as I read this and reviewed some of the readings, though, that it's one thing to think something's wrong, but live with it anyway, and think it might be better if we could not to hold these people as slaves. And one thing that really struck me as I reviewed some of these readings, I was going to say, is that the reach of Jefferson's imagination is actually a lot more than that. And he says some things that are kind of incoherent but very interesting and in a way I think speak well for him. I was thinking I noticed in the notes on the state of Virginia, the query on manners, he says this, with what execration should the statesman be loaded who, permitting one half of the citizens thus to trample on the rights of the other, transforms those into despots and these into enemies, destroys the morals of the one part and the amor patriae of the other, or the patriotism or love of country of the other. It's kind of interesting that he refers to the slaves as citizens, like he potentially can think of them that way. Seems like that's what I mean by incoherent. If you were thinking only as slaves, you wouldn't even use the word citizens to refer to them, or to think of them as in a way part of the country, because they should have patriotism. They can't have it. It's being destroyed by the slavery, or the experience of slavery. And then also later on in this letter to Demeunier, he actually refers to the slaves as our brethren. That's brothers. That's pretty good. He's foreseeing great possibilities there of a common humanity, even in the middle of slavery. Like I say, that's not just seeing that it's wrong and maybe be better to not have these people among us, not have slavery, but keep them as underlings, as Lincoln suggested that possibility, not the one that he ultimately wanted. But yeah, Jefferson's foreseeing the possibility of full equality, it seems to me.
Annette.
Well, back to the point about fear, yes, I think they did fear, and maybe I didn't complete my thought, that the earlier part of slavery, enslaved Africans were seen as the other. They were seen as exotic, and they were seen as potentially a threat. So definitely that period of time, I was making the distinction between that period of time and what happened in the antebellum period. Also, Jefferson, when he's in his 20s, copies in his commonplace book a poem, parts of a poem from William Shenstone about the evils of the slave trade, about the horror of a man being pulled from his native land and taken across the ocean to labor for other people. This is before the Revolution. This is before he is Thomas Jefferson or anything like that. So the sense that something is wrong with slavery, I mean, that's a bit of evidence right there that he's thinking about this well before that, and it probably grows out of his understanding of himself as an adherent to the Enlightenment, and that this is something that, this is in the toolkit of that, the sort of skepticism about science, skepticism about religion, belief in science, all those kinds of things. So he's on this path before. It doesn't take the Revolution to make him know that there's something wrong with slavery. And the last point, I mean, he's very contradictory in lots of ways. When he's in France, he's talking about, he has a letter where he's talking about the idea of bringing Germans to Monticello and mixing them with enslaved people. And the Germans, of course, will teach them industrious. We were just in Berlin last week, so it's sort of interesting to bring this up. German industriousness given to African American slaves, and then he talks about them as citizens, that they will grow up and to become citizens in the same way. Now, he doesn't act on that, it doesn't go anywhere, but to think about his circumstance, think about the context, that Jefferson lived slavery in a particular kind of way. He is married to a woman who has siblings who are enslaved, half of siblings who are enslaved. He is bound to these people. He doesn't say this, but it would be difficult to understand or to imagine that he could write about these circumstances without thinking about the people who are in his life on a daily basis, whom he's traveling, all of these people to whom he's connected by blood. It's not an abstraction to him. And his understanding of potential, I wonder, is not driven in part by his understanding of those particular people.
Joanne, then Colleen.
I wanted to what we're talking about in one way or another here is ambiguity, right? The word brethren, the word citizen, someone sifting through what they think at different times in different ways, and trying to make sense of something. And I wanted to pull Hamilton in, because Hamilton Hamilton doesn't have a lot to say about slavery overall in his writings, but one of the documents that we have here is one of the interesting ones, and it's the letter that he writes in 1779 to John Jay, in which he's writing in support of his friend John Lawrence's plan to arm black people and bring them in. I think 3 or 4 battalions of black soldiers is Lawrence's idea, and he supports it. But what's really interesting about the document is, partway down, he writes, he says, some people think that they would never make good soldiers. And he says, this is so far from appearing to me a valid objection, that I think their want of cultivation, and he puts in parentheses, for their natural faculties are, and initially writes, their natural faculties are perhaps as good as ours. And then he goes back and crosses that out and says, probably as good as ours. And it's really interesting to see him also kind of wrestling on paper with what he thinks and how that's going to play out into real life. It's when I teach it, I always say, look, revisions can reveal quite a bit. But that's a fascinating one that's preserved, but it's the same phenomenon that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and there's a, that when soldiers are, when people are confiscated, I think it's on British ships, and, oh no, when Americans are confiscated by the British, I don't know if I have this right, and they're slaves, and Hamilton insists that then they must be given their freedom and treated as human beings, and according to the law of nations, which is part of the law of nature. And I think for whatever ambiguity there is about the science question, you know, the kind of question about nature and nurture. I think both Hamilton and Jefferson, too, are not, I don't think there's ambiguity about whether all are human beings, all are men. I'm reminded a few years ago there was a copy of the Declaration of Independence, an original copy, at the Second Bank in Philadelphia, and I walked in and thought that I would see something that I knew, and I didn't. I saw something new. It was handwritten, and of course, they didn't have computers then. It was supposed to be a joke. Everybody wake up, it's after lunch. And in the original draft, this was the original draft of the Declaration, and the word men is mentioned 3 times in the original draft. The 2 times that you know, all men are created equal, and governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then later on in the list of grievances, Jefferson mentions men again, and talks about that despicable practice in which men are bought and sold. And of course, those men being bought and sold are not whites, and they're not all males. And he capitalizes men in these instances. And so he's emphasizing what he means there. So I don't think, whatever he may have been ambiguous about in terms of musical abilities, memories, and so on and so forth, the idea of humanity, I don't think is a question for him. And I just wanted to ask, though, because I think Steve's question is a good one and a fair one, and it's a difficult one. I mean, Washington manages to save up money to free his slaves. Jefferson doesn't. Madison doesn't either. Now, with Madison, I think his stepson had something to do with this. And I think he was actually paying for some of the debts of Dolly's son. Later on in life, in which she didn't even know about because it hurt her so much, and it was a lot of money that this fellow was spending and then making Madison pay for. So I can see some reason there for him not having the funds that he maybe tried to have to possibly do something about this. Why didn't Jefferson, why wasn't he able to save funds and do something about it? I think that's a fair question.
Before going on to the next name on the queue, I want to, I forget who, somebody down on this end just talked about Jefferson's religious skepticism. So one of the things that strikes me is how the forceful language that Jefferson uses, religious language that Jefferson uses when he talks about slavery. The best known example is in this selection from the notes on Virginia. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and so on and so forth. In a letter to de Munier in June of 1786, he finishes by saying, and we must await with patience the workings of an overruling providence and hope that that is preparing the deliverance of these our suffering brethren. So on the one hand, we have divine providence, a just God who is eventually going to teach us, if you know, just jumping ahead, if you know Lincoln's reflection on the divine will, in which he says, God's letting this war go on. Both sides are suffering terrible losses. God may not be on either side, is an interesting connection with Jefferson. But then we also get the progress of the human mind in his letter to Chastelet when he says, I don't want these notes, especially the section on slavery, to be made public. He looks to the next generation of students at, I guess, is it William and Mary, the University of Virginia by this time? I guess it's William and Mary. The next generation, right? The progress of the human mind. So why is it that he recurs to this very strong religious language in dealing with slavery? Is it an indication that he's got of the fact that he's at sea and has no idea of what to do? So I'll just put that out there. And I think next up is John, and then Annette. So John.
Okay. We're being way too kind to Jefferson. Andrew, you can disown me in a few minutes. Part of the problem here is we're not distinguishing Jefferson in the 70s and 80s from Jefferson in the teens and the 20s. All praise to Jefferson. He says slavery's terrible. He hates slavery. He writes these wonderful things about the rights of man. Yeah. The problem with fear is the fear changes. And yeah, it exists earlier, but the fear changes after Gabriel's Rebellion and after the Haitian Revolution. And he's saying something very different in the teens and in the 20s. He's asked in the teens, won't you write and denounce slavery? And he said, well, that's the next generation's problem. Poor me, I can't do anything about it. I'm just poor retired Thomas Jefferson. Nobody listens to me. When he forms UVA, he says one of the reasons we need a Southern university is because all these Southern students are being taught abolitionism up north. We've got to get them back south because we don't want them infected with that terrible idea. He goes off the rails about the Missouri Compromise because it's an outrage. It's an outrage that the federal government would try to tell a state what to do about its issue of slavery. Never mind that that's exactly what was done in the Northwest Territories Act and the Southwest Territories Act, which he wrote in the 1780s. So the issue with Jefferson, now there's answers to all of these things, but I think part of the problem with talking about all these wonderful things that Jefferson says about slavery and how terrible it is in the 1770s and the 1780s is you need to grapple with Jefferson in the 1810s and the 1820s when he seems to be talking very differently. Now why? I think fear has changed. and increased. Secondly, he's getting older. You know, the guy is not the same. Older people can sometimes get more conservative. That may be part of what's going on. Not you. We exempt Peter from a lot of normal human behaviors. But I think that's the question that has to be grappled with, is the later Jefferson.
And then Peter.
Okay, I will let Peter deal with the later Jefferson.
The later Onuf.
The later Onuf too, the later Jefferson Onuf. Well, I mean, first, why doesn't he emancipate his slaves? Jefferson was not a fan of individual emancipation. He thought that this was a problem that should be solved on a society-wide basis, that it really didn't do any good for individual people to emancipate enslaved people, and it may make you feel good, but you're not really solving the problem, which is a society-wide problem. As to the comparison, and so he does eventually emancipate only 5, he emancipates 5 people in his will, 3 people, maybe 4 people just by letting them go, and 2 people early on, inter vivos emancipations in the 1790s. The comparison to George Washington, number one, George Washington had no children of his body. He had grandchildren, he had stepchildren, and not that he didn't love them, but those people had a Custis fortune that would tide them over. The difference between emancipating his slaves and knowing that his step-grandchildren would in fact have other slaves and have other money and were prosperous people, versus Jefferson, who was bankrupt when he died, and had been participating in a disastrous loan, a couple of loans for a relative in the middle of the Panic of 1819 that started and didn't, if he'd lived a bit longer, when the economy recovered, he might have been in a different situation. He still wouldn't have freed all of his slaves. But I mean, the Washington and Jefferson comparison is not, I don't think the two situations are on all fours with one another. After he came out of the presidency, he'd made enough money, if he had been less profligate in entertaining. His style of politicking, the dinner party style of politicking, was incredibly expensive. And Louisa Adams talks in her diary, says, and he pays for all of it himself, and it was sort of a marvel that he was doing this kind of thing. So he could have saved money and enslaved and freed slaves, but he wouldn't have done it for the reason I said before. He didn't believe in that. And as the comparison to Washington and Adams, Washington and Jefferson, as I said, I just don't think the two situations are on all fours.
Jefferson definitely gets older. That's why I'm easing up on him in my old age, because I identify with him more. But I want to come back to this idea of thinking of slaves as brothers or brethren and the citizens, all very important ideas. But to me, it's precisely his recognition of enslaved people collectively as the enemy that is a grant of their humanity. Because it's only in the context of war that you have, and this a full recognition and realization that your lives are in the hands of your enemies potentially, and they have the capacity. It's that notion of capacity. Of course, you're right, Kevin, about the horrors of slavery and the awareness of the danger that discontented slaves make to you and your family, and burn the place down. All kinds of bad things could happen, but they are very much local and specific, and they are interpreted as the failure of mastery in many cases. The thing about recognizing enslaved people as a nation in chains, a captive nation, is that the only way that equality can be realized and peace can be established is by granting that nation its independence, to declare them a free and independent people, as he says in Query 14, and send them someplace else where they can have a country of their own. That notion of they are potential citizens, they have a potential relationship with the country, but not this one, damn it, because of course, remember, That's the whole point of settler constitutionalism and legality, is to establish that enduring relationship between owners and what they own, the land, country, and people together. You can't have two peoples in one country. But this is a recognition of equality. And in some ways, his opposition, as Annette suggests, to incremental reform, and we used to say this back in the 60s when we were waiting for a revolution, right, is that ameliorative liberal was a pejorative term first from the radical left, not from the right. Liberals would temporize, and they would, in fact, preclude the global solution of a radical revolution because they would make do with things, but we needed real change. The thing about recognizing the nationhood of enslaved African Americans is two things. One, to you, John, once Jefferson had figured it out, no matter how much he changed, he didn't change his thinking about the solution to the slavery problem. And that created a kind of a vicious downward circle because he backed himself into a corner, to mix my metaphors. There was nothing he could do if they wouldn't do everything. But he never became a paternalist. That's the important thing. I should have made that clear. I talked about domesticity coming full circle, but he understands that these enslaved people are not his children. He won't go that final step toward paternalism as antebellum defenders of slavery did. One last thing about the equality, the future equality of enslaved people. Take the nation idea and think about it historically. The idea of race and nation are very close. One of the indictments of Jefferson is that he is the first proto-enlightened scientific race theorist. It's anachronistic judgment on him. It has plausibility because he says things that he suspects about the inferiority of enslaved people. But those are only suspicions, he says. Our problem, if you think that race and nation are coterminous, that is, the Irish people were thought of as a race. You could even think of a religious or sectarian group as being a kind of race. It doesn't have the edge it has now with its notions of genetic inevitability and a permanent, the notion of white supremacy. Those things take their modern pathological form at a later time. Things are looser at this point. When we think of Jefferson's solution to the slavery problem, we're focusing on race, not nation, and in doing so, we project our own ideas about race onto Jefferson's solution. This is our challenge, is to try to keep in play the protean character of the word race and the word nation at a moment in Western history when establishing who's in and who's out of what nations is crucial to the future of the modern world. So here's the pathetic result of Jefferson's non-solution, is that full equality for enslaved people, which a just God would decree in the case of a war. I think that's the crucial thing about the Wheel of Fortune will turn because of violence that we cannot control. That is an accurate prediction of how slavery, in fact, is ended in the most of the places where it's established is through war. The God of wars, I think, is the God, Steve, that we're talking about here. That's when he can't avoid that great cosmic indeterminacy of what's going to happen if there were a war. The equality that we imagine that an advocate of human rights would grant to his fellow people who happen to be in chains can only emerge in the fullness of time. Here's another dimension of historical thinking. It's going to emerge in the fullness of time when enslaved people have countries of their own and they can come onto the world stage and encounter other peoples. This is the great era of romantic nationalism we're on the cusp of this, of the self-determination of peoples is the great cry of the 19th and well into the 20th century, if not to today. But when's it going to happen? Where is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? And it wasn't going to happen simply because Jefferson said it had to happen if we were to prevent race war.
Let me read the queue and make sure I've got everybody who wants to speak. Kevin, Andrew, Doug, John Bowles, and Michael. Did I miss anybody? Okay, Kevin, then Andrew.
Well, a couple of things. When Colleen was talking about Jefferson's money problems and the issue in relation to Washington has been addressed, but I wanted to say in regard to Madison, there is a story, I think, from Henry Clay that Madison had some kind of oral agreement with Dolly that since she likely would outlive him and they knew how George's freeing his slaves upon Martha's death and George's will had played out for Martha, that they wouldn't make that part of James's will, but that supposedly the understanding was that Dolly, likely the survivor, would free them in her arrangements. And then her desire to continue to live the high life and her wastrel son's gambling debts meant that instead she sold people off for money, mostly. So that was one point I wanted to make. But anyway, if that's true, and of course there's an obvious motivation for somebody like Clay to absolve James of this, but if that's true, then James tried to take Washington family experience into account and make the same kind of provision. Then John said that we're being too easy on Jefferson because we're ignoring the exchange with Coles about freeing people. And Jefferson, okay, so Jefferson is said to have committed treason against the hopes of the world by his most eminent or prominent critic on this score, in that he didn't act against slavery more vociferously in retirement. Jefferson said in his correspondence on this question, number one, my views on these matters have been before the public for 40 years and they have not changed. So if I were to repeat myself, I likely wouldn't advance this cause. Beside which, I have other causes I'm interested in trying to advocate. One of which was to establish a university in Charlottesville. Now, some people have said, well, this is a ruse. He's just hiding. He wants to pose as anti-slavery. But it wasn't only this matter that Jefferson refused publicly to advocate in retirement because he thought it would annoy people and detract from his efforts in regard to UVA. He also was asked by his lifelong friend, Governor John Tyler, in 1814, pleased to come out of retirement and seek election to the House of Delegates so that he could be the chief proponent in the legislature of Tyler's primary school program. And Jefferson gave him the same explanation of why he wouldn't do that. He said, I don't want to detract from my effort in regard to a public post-secondary school. So I think that's plausible. Besides which, John quotes Jefferson saying that our boys are going up to Yankee land and coming back with abolitionism. But Jefferson didn't actually say abolitionism in that letter. He said they were coming back with foreign principles or hostile principles or something to that effect. And the Missouri crisis in Jefferson's mind was not only a controversy about slavery, it was also a controversy about the nature of the Union and what kind of government people would have in every state. So if they went off to Harvard and came back with Rufus King's political principles or John Quincy Adams' political principles, which Jefferson was fulminating against to his death, after he read John Quincy Adams' inaugural address, he went bonkers. It's a technical legal term. So I think it's just not right to say that Jefferson was unhappy about the Missouri crisis and didn't want Virginia boys infected with the kind of what would be the Whig position on this question, because he was worried about having Yankees interfere with slavery. It, to him, meant the entire revolution. The revolution was at stake, he thought, in the Missouri crisis. So although I don't generally want to defend Jefferson's stewardship either of his own inherited wealth or of this matter of the slaves in his household, I do think that he's been mischaracterized unfairly in this conversation.
Andrew and then Doug.
I wanted to pick up the thread of Hamilton and slavery. It's important to understand the world that Hamilton's coming from. He grows up on the Caribbean island of Nevis, which has a ratio of slave to free people of 8 to 1. And most of these slaves survive fewer than 5 years. So Caribbean slavery is a particularly savage kind of slavery. And so Hamilton comes out of this world having seen, nearly 90% of his island's population die within just a few years, and then get replenished, and those people die. And so he develops this aversion to slavery. And I think when we look at Hamilton's thinking about the Haitian Revolution, he is arguably better situated than any other founder to think about Caribbean slavery and what a free society might look like in the Caribbean. And what's really interesting in this letter that you've picked out for the packet, where he writes to Timothy Pickering, on the one hand, Hamilton does support the Haitian Revolution, but he also says no regular system of liberty will at present suit. And he suggests, basically a military rule. And to me, the really interesting question, and I don't think I have a great answer to this, and I'm just posing this because I'm hoping someone will pick up this thread, is this because Hamilton has doubts about the ability of newly freed slaves to engage in a democratic project or a Republican project? Or is he really projecting his own frustrations about the 1790s onto Haiti? And when he talks about wanting the executive to have the power to make war and treaties, is he really responding to his experiences in the Washington administration? When he talks about wanting to empower generals, does this have anything to do with the fact that he is then serving as a general in the Adams administration? And so to me, when we think about Hamilton and slavery, and particularly Hamilton and the Haitian Revolution, I think there's a really interesting conundrum, and I hope that some of my fellow panelists might be willing to pick this up in a future comment.
Doug.
John said many of the things I wanted to say about Jefferson, but I think even if we, I often get accused of biting the hands that feed me. I mean, we get invited to these conferences to talk about the founders, but sometimes I think the founders mislead us when we try to understand American history. So that's one thing to think about. And I think this is where Jefferson is especially relevant on the question of slavery. And even if you go back to the 1780s, when Jefferson is writing the Notes, which is not a popular book, it does not become canonical. These passages he has about how he's, trembling when he knows God is just, is that what other people are doing in the 1780s? And I hear, I'm just, my students know, we don't read the Notes on the State of Virginia. We read the pro-slavery petitions, right? We read about St. George Tucker's, incredible failure to get anything resembling anti-slavery moving in Virginia. Thomas Coke getting run off of plantations when he's peddling his Methodist notion that maybe slavery is inconsistent with God. Who are the founders? I mean, are these people founders? All those people who signed those petitions, criticizing the manumission law, not the general emancipation idea is totally off the table for them, but they're even upset about manumission. Who are they? So Jefferson's dilemma, Jefferson's wrestling with his conscience, Jefferson's understanding of, this is the people, and who are the people? In this case, is it the people against Jefferson? we've said this before, it doesn't seem to be something that rises to the level in which there's a real political movement against slavery in Jefferson, Virginia. Like Kevin said, Jefferson had his eyes out there before the public for 40 years. And where do they get? They don't get anywhere, really. If anything, Virginia backtracks on manumission, even in the early 19th century. And if Jefferson, and Peter, he's dead right, Jefferson never becomes a paternalist, but lots of other people did. And lots of people were doing that even in the 1780s. So Jefferson's, I think, again, on the larger question of slavery in the early republic, of slavery in the American project, we have to go beyond Jefferson, beyond the founders, or at least look at these other founders to sort of get a sense of, and I think Hamilton's kind of silence on the slavery question speaks to this. This is not what he's going to spend his political energy working on. It's not really a burning question before the American people. It might be a burning question for people like Thomas Jefferson.
John Bowles, then Michael, then John John down here. John.
I had several things I wanted to say, but commenting about some of the previous remarks, but I think it's also important to let students know all these documents have to be read in the context of their time. Every single letter, they're corresponding to people. You cannot just simply pick out a letter or pick out a phrase or a quote and think that you can read it in some sense in isolation. Nearly all the founding fathers, I think all the founding fathers, actually believed in 1780 or 1785 that slavery was a dying institution. They thought slavery was outmoded. They didn't know how it would change, how it would end, when it would end, but there was a pretty strong consensus that slavery was a dying institution. We know it wasn't. For example, Jefferson didn't foresee the cotton gin. He didn't foresee the kind of rise of slavery across the South. So nearly all of them think slavery is dying. Nearly every one of them, if not all of them, thought that the Union was a very fragile experiment. Again, students today find that hard to believe because we know that slavery did not end real quickly and easily, and we know the nation survived. But you read the letters of the founding fathers, or whether it's Hamilton or Washington or Jefferson, they all are very worried about the continuation of the nation. So, for example, in one of the first meetings of Congress in March 1790, when there were a couple of anti-slavery petitions addressed, and the representatives from Georgia and South Carolina basically go nuts, it scares everybody because they can see that that the nation is so fragile, it could fall apart right now. And after that, no one, Jefferson, not Hamilton, who seemed to have an opinion on everything, no one spoke out much about slavery because they saw that emancipation, like Voldemort, was a word you couldn't say. And so one of the reasons I think people like Jefferson don't have the sense of urgency we wish they had is because they're dealing with the context. They think somehow slavery is a dying institution, and is the nation going to survive? And you are unwilling to sort of wreck the chances of the nation on behalf of a cause you think was going to work out anyway. Now, again, those assumptions turn out to be wrong. But people in 1780 didn't know what we know, and it's hard for us to remember that. Also, let me say just a few things about some of the earlier comments. It's not really true that Jefferson in the 1780s only had rosy things and then didn't sort of pass it off to the younger generation until the teens. Actually, in 1785 and 86 and 87, when he is first publishing an English translation of Notes on Virginia, he assumes that book would be too controversial to be publicly spread throughout the South, but should simply go to the students at the College of William and Mary, because he thought those were the young leaders who would be able to affect the kind of changes he already perceived his generation would not be able to see. So he's, it's not, he doesn't just go from being totally rosy to totally, that's not. Also the question about Washington and Jefferson. Washington had the luck, or maybe he was pretty shrewd in this, he married a really, really wealthy woman. And George Washington was an extremely aggressive land speculator and grabbed up tens of thousands of acres of land in the West. Jefferson didn't do that. So that, for example, when Washington retires from the presidency, He's making no money on slavery at Mount Vernon. His money is coming from rents on his western lands and some on fishery in the Potomac River. Jefferson didn't have all those western lands, and his wife, although her father died, and she and then Jefferson inherited land and slaves, Jefferson also inherits an immense debt. So Washington inherits great wealth and has thousands and thousands of acres in the West on which he's making revenue. Jefferson is stuck with a debt he never gets out from under the rest of his life. And it's impossible to think about how Jefferson responds to slavery without taking into consideration these issues. I mean, you know, for example, there was a law passed in Virginia in 1791, I believe it was. It said if a person is in debt, if that person frees any slaves, his creditors can seize those slaves. I mean, so there are, and then also in 1806, the law was passed. It says if you free a slave, that slave has to leave the state within 1 year or be re-enslaved. Washington, wealthy, doesn't have to worry about the first law, and then he luckily dies in 1799 before he has to worry about the 1806 law. So before we sort of just casually think that if Jefferson was really a good person, he would have just instantly freed all his slaves, there are legal and moral and family consequences that we have to take into context. It's frighteningly difficult. And all of us who in many ways admire parts of Jefferson are disappointed that he didn't have the creativity or imagination or something to do what probably none of us would have had the courage to do. But it's really easy to make moral judgments about the failures in the past when for us it's just simply a sentence and it wouldn't require, I mean, I try to get students to think about how easy is it in this nation to get people to think about really doing something about gun deaths. We all know it's crazy and wrong, and we kill 30,000 people a year by guns, more than any other country, you know, yet we don't know how to solve it. We're also aware that there are huge climate problems. We don't know how to solve it. We can't summon the will to do it. Yet we can so easily criticize people in the past who didn't summon the will to do things that they found extremely difficult. So I guess I call for some humility in being too free of how we judge people in the past.
Michael, then John Ragasta, and then Joanne.
Thanks. I had my comments in mind already before John spoke, but some of the things he said, one I'd like to say I agree with a lot of what he said, and I especially appreciate the comment about it's so easy to judge people in the past when we give ourselves kind of a free pass very often for what we're not doing. But I would, you know, I just finished a book on Abraham Lincoln, and what John was saying put me in mind of this phrase that Lincoln used frequently in his own career when he said he wanted to return public opinion in America to what it had been at the time of the founding, which is that the founders lived in the expectation that slavery was in course of ultimate extinction. And one of the things, I mean, I'm not going to bore you with details, but one of the things I concluded in my book anyway, was that Lincoln was living, maybe a better way to put it would have been, say, the founders lived in the hope that slavery was in course of ultimate extinction, but I don't think they had a clear expectation. They didn't have a clear idea of how it would happen, when it would happen. I think Peter made this point already. So I don't think it was as clear to them quite as, at least I would disagree with what John said about that. Otherwise, agreeing with much of what he did say.
I didn't say they were clear.
No,
They
yeah.
just believed it.
No, that's right. Yeah, but I call that a hope. Yeah. But what I did want to do is put on the table some other questions about Jefferson that surprisingly have not been much talked about, which is I see a serious tension within Jefferson, which plays out in a number of different ways. And looking at Jefferson more as an individual now, that is, on the one side, Jefferson believed, and I believe, sincerely believed, as opposed to many scholars who don't take him seriously in his belief. He seriously believed, I think, that slavery was a gross injustice and that it was a bad institution, both for masters and slaves, and that it certainly shouldn't exist in the world. On the other hand, he also was the recipient of some of the great benefits of slavery as individual. He cultivated the idea of a good life more than almost any other American, that is a self-conscious pursuit of the very good things in life, which could only be done with the kind of wealth that slavery made possible for him. So that on the one hand, he had this conscientious conviction against slavery, but on the other hand, whether he'd admit it quite to himself or not, he benefited greatly from that institution. So we need to keep that in mind. And I think the tension within him got then reflected in his approach to public policy issues about slavery. And so, well, there's a famous statement that he made later on than the earliest period, but we have the wolf by the ears and we can't hold him and we can't let him go. And I think that's the way Jefferson formulated the question to himself. That's the public equivalent of the private tension that he felt in himself. And one of the ways in which he expressed that tension, one of the problems, he admitted slavery, of course, was bad for the slaves, but he also thought that freedom, emancipation, was bad for the slaves as well. That is to say, he didn't think that the slaves could just sort of mingle into American society. So he had in his mind a kind of rationale for holding back, both from personally emancipating his own slaves, which we see there were many problems with in addition to this, but also with a general public policy. So Jefferson was among those who always associated the possibility of emancipation with some sort of colonization scheme. That is, both from the point of view of the possibilities of a biracial society, from both the point of view of the whites and the blacks, and from the point of view of the thriving of the black people, if freed, it would have to be somewhere else. He just didn't foresee the possibility or see how it would be possible to have a biracial society. And that was a dilemma, holding the wolf by the ears, which he certainly didn't find a solution to, but which also, I think, held him back. All those hesitations and reservations and excuses that he made. You know, 40 years ago, I said something or other, I'm sure, that has still not taken effect in the world. But there might be a reason to say it again. You know, we have a new generation. In fact, from Jefferson's calculation, we have 2 new generations on the scene by that time. So he might have renewed some of his reservations about slavery. Instead, what he did was develop this theory of scientific racism. And as Peter said, he put it forward in a very scientific spirit. These are just hypotheses, observations. You know, maybe it's like this, maybe it's not. But it is striking that in those places, he also, in that same writing, Notes on Virginia, he goes out of his way. He goes out of his way to say, to distinguish the American slaves from Roman slaves, to distinguish American slaves from American Indians, in both of which cases he makes a lot of argumentation about why he suspects that the black slaves are inferior in ways that the Roman slaves were not, and that it isn't slavery that's the cause of the problem, it's them. And likewise with the American Indians, he makes a huge number of explanations of why the American Indians were he admired the American Indians very much and wanted to integrate them into American society. And so he has a distinctly different attitude, and I would say, unbeknownst to him, certainly, so many of the things he did turned out to be so terrible for the future of slavery in America and the future of race relations in America, and for the coming of the Civil War even. So I'm usually a fan and a defender of Jefferson, and I'm surprising myself I'm harsher on Jefferson than Peter is, which hardly ever happens. So anyway, I'll stop with that.
John, Joanne.
Peter's harsh on Jefferson? Wait a minute. It's a different Peter. I think there's a lot of things. I think Michael's comment that you couldn't simply drop these people into society and expect them to operate. I want to come back to Andrew raises the question about Hamilton's discussion of the military system in Haiti. Jefferson says much the same thing about the French because they've been poisoned with tyranny for centuries under Roman Catholicism. So you can't take a people that is not familiar with how to govern oneself, who is not familiar with anything but tyranny, and simply expect them to participate in a Republican society. So that's certainly part of what's going on, and I think that's what partially Hamilton says you're going to have a military system in Haiti for a while. But as to some of these issues, certainly it is true that in the 1780s, they thought, they hoped, Michael John can come up with the right word, that slavery would disappear. By the 1790s, we have the cotton gin. Jefferson lives for another 30 years knowing that we have the cotton empire. So to say he believed it was going to end in the 1780s doesn't really resolve the issue. As to abolitionism in the North, he does not use that term in the letter to Breckinridge in 1821. Read the letter. He's talking about abolitionism. Certainly he is concerned, Kevin's correct, he is concerned about federalism, he's concerned about the infection of federalism, but abolitionism is one of the things that concerns him. And the same thing with the Missouri Compromise. You can say, well, he's concerned about government structure. Yeah, you distinguish for me legally the Missouri Compromise abuse of government structure from the Southwest Territories and Northwest Territories Act. Peter and I have had the argument before. But I think, though, that Michael and Peter are getting to the real nub of the issue, which I think is really getting to the problem. Michael says he couldn't understand a biracial society, and Peter talks about a people. Once he recognizes that these are a people, he's in some ways recognized their equality. The problem is, why not race mixing? He's engaged in a little of it himself on the side, but why can't we have race mixing? He says with respect to Native Americans that they have a choice. They can either go extinct, they can move west, or they can mix into our society. And he would accept that. He says that's what should happen with the Native Americans, is they should simply become Americans like us. He doesn't recognize that for African Americans. Now, why? And I think there are some answers to it. And actually, John Bowles, you'll have to tell me, it was your student who was on fellowship this year at Carol Rogers, fascinating work on aesthetics. Now, we have to stop immediately, and the students take a philosophy course on aesthetics. Read Edmund Burke on aesthetics. It's not simply appearance. It has a much greater philosophical connotation in the 18th century. But that if you read notes, one of the issues which he can't get over is the aesthetics issue. And I think it's hard for us to understand that. But I think that's one of the things that's going on. I think there's a lot of things going on in his mind. I think the impossibility, I think he's getting older and says, I can't solve this problem. Yes, he has debts. He's also living quite well. And it's true he could not, at the very end, have emancipated his slaves because of the debts. That was not an issue, up through, when does the loan go bad? 1820? That was not an issue for most of the time. So I think there are things going on, but I think it's more complicated than simply saying, oh, he couldn't. There were things he certainly could have done. And I said, I would point, I think Carol Rogers' work, which hopefully will be coming out soon in print, very interesting work on Jefferson is responding in his views on slavery, and he's very concerned about aesthetics.
Thank you, panel. It is now your turn to ask questions if you have a question. There were readings on things other than slavery, even though we spent this entire hour and 15 minutes talking about slavery. So if you've got a question, make your way to a microphone.
I have a question from the last session. I was wondering how Jefferson and Hamilton viewed natural rights and how they were similar and how they were different on how they viewed and defined natural rights.
Similarities and differences on natural rights, Jefferson and Hamilton. Who wants to answer?
I want to make a comment just to summarize something I've been hearing about Jefferson not wanting to repeat himself. If Jefferson had been a college professor, he wouldn't have minded at all repeating himself. On natural rights, I I think there was a general understanding in the 18th century, and the panel here can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but, I mean, the question is, did they understand natural rights in the context of 18th century natural law theory? And that's my understanding in reading both of them, when the sources Jefferson cites in the letter to Henry Lee, for example, Sidney and Locke, and you think of, Hamilton did a lot of work on this, and he particularly read Vattel on this, and that's a pretty traditional natural law theory. I don't think it's simply the Hobbesian natural law theory that rejects the moral basis. But of course, that's something that's very controversial among scholars, and so there may be a difference of opinion on that on this panel.
I would say that it's interesting that Hamilton, although frequently using language of natural rights, never, to my knowledge, actually talks about them, actually tries to give us an account of what they might be or where they come from. Whereas Jefferson, on several occasions, does do that. He has some discussion in the Notes on Virginia. He has this interesting letter to his friend DuPont, in which he tries to articulate a theory, actually a theory of natural rights. So it seems to me that at least operationally they understand natural rights rather similarly, but it isn't clear that they understand them the same philosophically, partly because maybe some of the Hamiltonians here will be able better to tell me, but I just can't recall any place where Hamilton tried to lay out some sort of theory of rights.
Carson and then Brad.
I was just going to say simply, I think that Jefferson had my impression is Jefferson has a more expansive understanding of natural rights than Hamilton. Certain passages where later on Jefferson speaks of Republican self-government as being a matter of natural right. I think he said the French revolutionaries show themselves to be in the vanguard of natural right. Hamilton believes in natural rights. I don't think he believes that Republican self-government is a matter of natural right. He says he's in favor of it. He thinks it's a beautiful, noble thing if people can govern themselves, but it might not work. If it doesn't work, we'll establish some kind of more conservative, constitutional, partly based upon consent government that would still protect natural rights, understood in a more limited sense of right to property, right to liberty, things like that. Language Hamilton uses, he often refers to, as a colleague of mine reminded me on a similar panel once, not principles, but maxims. These maxims of politics. Like a general rule, but they admit of exceptions in certain cases. So it's like he's more likely to go to that kind of language than language of natural rights. And that brings me, I guess, to my second point, which is that it seems like Jefferson's more likely to recur to the idea of natural rights in thinking through any problem that comes before him. And I think Hamilton's less likely to think of it that way. Natural rights are something important to get right when you're founding the government. And then a lot of what happens after you're running the government is thinking through what would be fair in the sense of prudent and what would be prudent in the sense of expedient. Yeah.
Brad.
Yeah, that's very good. I agree with what Carson just said. Hamilton does talk about natural rights quite a lot during the Revolutionary period, but they all did. And so that doesn't distinguish him in any way from Jefferson. If Hamilton has an account of natural rights, and I'm hard-pressed to think of it would be in those early pamphlets of his, The Farmer Refuted and the Vindication of the Rights of the Colonists in 1775. But once he turns his mind to establishing government, the language of natural rights almost disappears, I think, from Hamilton's writing. It struck me in Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, which is a beautiful letter and talks about natural right. And Jefferson says, in reference to them, the defense of the rights of conscience, he says he shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. And I was thinking about that, thinking, well, what would Hamilton think about that? And I think Hamilton would probably agree with that, and that's why he would disagree with Jefferson about the expansiveness of natural rights. anything that Hamilton would see, anything that threatens the order of society is a threat to the social duties, and therefore we ought not to be calling those threats natural rights.
Yes, sir.
Hi. So when we're trying to understand the distinction that Jefferson makes between Africans and natives in Notes on the State of Virginia, to what extent do we have to take into account or factor for that he's writing a response to Buffon, who has this degeneracy theory, which places sort of this great pride in the native peoples of the American land and the native peoples of the English land?
Annette?
It's very important because he's out to prove that things in the New World don't degenerate. And what better example of that than the people who are native to North America? And he looks at them and finds that they're in great form, that they could perhaps become at our level or whatever. It's critical. He's defending North America against the charge of degeneracy, and they are the best examples of doing that. They are native to this place. Africans, he doesn't, if Africans were native to this place, what would you have said? But definitely they are part of the life in America, and that they are a way of refuting what he said. Peter?
Peter?
I'd like to make the point that in some ways his vision of the future of indigenous people is much darker than that of enslaved people. In our retrospect, well, they're both pretty horrible, so it's a bad story all around. But if native people don't live white, if they don't adapt settled agriculture, and of course we students of ethno-historian types know that of course there is settled agriculture, and this stereotype of a hunters and gatherers is a figment of the Scottish Enlightenment stadial theorists. They don't really understand how, in fact, Native peoples have adjusted to the presence of whites in the hemisphere for a long time, and adjusted very well. But for Jefferson, it's only through this assimilation, cultural assimilation, and absorption into white society, which is, after all, every Virginian's fantasy of a good family genealogy is to go back to Pocahontas, right? But how would they be educated, if it's a problem of education, to survive? Because that's the choice they face. It would be by settling down and, in effect, giving way to the tide of white settlement. The realism in Jefferson's projection is that settlement frontier, sponsored by a powerful state, believe it or not, is an irresistible force, and it behooves Indians to become white. Whereas the training for life in every society in the world practically is mostly agricultural, and guess what? Enslaved people do the agriculture in Virginia. They know all about it. So notwithstanding the conspicuous slurs or suggestions of inferiority, that they don't have capacity, well, they have the capacity that yeoman farmers have, that is to produce a living from the land. They just need a land to do it on. So in some ways, I think his notion of black nationhood in another place is, of course, ridiculous. It's not going to be fulfilled. But we usually think that he's much more generous about Indians than he is about blacks, and I don't know that that's true. I think he's actually reflecting the real circumstances that enslaved people are in our midst, and they have been educated by that presence in our midst, for better and for worse. The basic skill set is exportable. Let's export them. Facing Native Americans, it's the modern world facing an earlier phase of its own history, still alive on the fringes in the Celtic periphery in the British Isles, where we have barbarous peoples that, like the Scots, have to be civilized in the 18th century. That's happening coincidentally with the encounter with Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere. That, in some ways, there's no holding back the tide of history. This is what what these exponents of modern civilization are suggesting. You can't hold back history. He has a program through colonization of incorporating enslaved people when the institution is finally extinguished into the modern world. So I think it's mixed, and we tend, when we assign this on tests, to say, oh, everybody says, oh my God, he's so good about Indians, and why couldn't he be more generous about the capacity of blacks? I think we tend to exaggerate that.
And Ed.
What I wanted to say on this point of intermingling, there's no way that Jefferson in the 1780s and the 1790s could suggest that white people and black people intermix. I mean, sometimes we write history, we imagine the people that we're not writing about, everybody in Virginia is like us, or like modern people. These are well-meaning people who, if they just had the right proselytizing, would see the light and see that black people were just as good as white people. Every single thing Jefferson says in the Notes in the State of Virginia, the vast majority of people in Virginia then, and I would say a huge number of white people today in the country believe. White people are smarter than black people. White people look better than black people. There can't be any general intermixture between the two races. So it's just not, I mean, if we were to talk about him as a projector, it's just not realistic to think that he could have advocated that during his time period. It was against the law for black people and white people to marry people in Virginia until 1967, when the Supreme Court had to come down and say, that's wrong. So he didn't cause that. He didn't create the society that said that. You could say, well, maybe he was the beginner of scientific racism. Jefferson did not have to teach Virginians to be racist in that time period, or to believe that white people were superior to black people. And it's just not, it's unrealistic, I think, to suggest that that could have been a possibility. That's not something that could be talked about. It's difficult now. Someone did a commercial 3 years ago that had a mixed couple, a Cheerios commercial, and they were inundated with hostile comments about this particular portrayal. So, that's just not, it's just not in the cards. That kind of thing wasn't in the cards. Native Americans, I think Peter is right. I mean, obviously he's explaining, in this notion of a great chain of being, with the Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. Jefferson is being scientific, Lamarckian categorization, all those kinds of things about who is on top and who is at the bottom. And there was just no space for that. That's a non-starter. And I said earlier, if he had done some of the things, or the things that I would like him to have done, and other people, we would not be talking about him. Can you just imagine Jefferson writing down saying, oh, I know, let's all intermix? That would be the answer to it. That would have been the answer to his career.
So I just wanted to ask a question, going back to the point on Jefferson's fear. Jefferson's view change. So did Jefferson's view change from the teens to the 70s and 80s due to the composition of his family or fear? And where is the origin of that fear coming from? Did the fear sprout from the fear of death and the finality of it all? Or did his fear sprout from God, and that when the day of reckoning came, that he would be unable to enter eternal life because of his sins due to slavery?
Let's take that.
John?
I don't think he's worried about his eternal soul is not what's bothering him. And the fear change and it obviously occurs over time, tends to be more associated with the Haitian Revolution and Gabriel's Rebellion. So he lives for another 25, 26 years after that. So to the extent that, and Kevin is certainly correct, fear exists beforehand, but to the extent that fear becomes much more intimate, much more immediate, that has nothing to do with his being older, per se. I do think his being older has an effect. My point is not that we can't explain Jefferson's views in the 1810s and 1820s. I just think that one has to explain them differently than his views in the 70s and 80s. And I think fear is part of that. I think aging is part of that. I think aesthetic, again, defined broadly in a philosophic term, is part of that. To be clear, to Annette's point, no one is suggesting, and Kevin makes the point that he would not have gotten the University of Virginia if he'd come out publicly and really pushed emancipation or certainly race mixing. Obviously not. He's not going to say that. But it is still, even in his personal writings, it is still notable the distinction between his views on race mixing among Native Americans and African Americans. But certainly it is true that if he had said something about that, if he had suggested race mixing publicly, he's done.
Yes, ma'am.
So I think this goes off a little bit of the previous question, and when we were talking about the fact that Jefferson wasn't a paternalist, and something that I find just fascinating is the inner turmoil of Jefferson and how he was just a very contradictory, dichotomous man. And so I'm wondering, did Jefferson try and rationalize slavery to himself, like in his own mind? Because often I find that paternalism is a way in which slave owners would rationalize slavery to themselves and the positive good that it had. So I don't know if you could just speak to like the inner morals of Jefferson in that respect.
Okay. I'm speaking on behalf of my co-author here. We've solved all this problem, so you don't have to lose any more sleep, okay?
I was worried.
And the short version is he didn't lose all that much sleep. I think we project big problems into Jefferson's mind, and it doesn't mean they weren't big problems, only, and I think this is a point John and others made earlier, put it in context of what the big problems were for him. But our answer is somewhat different, and that is to think of the notion of the authority of fathers or patriarchs within their families, and to think of the family as inhabiting a household that includes non-kin, servants, or enslaved people. This is, as I pointed out before, the basic unit of production in an agricultural society. Jefferson's conception of his role as the patriarch of his world, and in his exchange with Kirkeville and others in the 1816, he talks about why it's important to have a federal system that goes from the Union down to states, to the counties, to the ward or township, as he calls it. And the final term, in a letter he writes to Cabell in 1816, is that the farm or plantation is a world unto itself, over which nobody has better knowledge of what is the right thing to do for that world than the owner, the father, the steward. Because, of course, this notion of patriarchal responsibility includes an asymmetrical reciprocity. That is, he does things for others, he pursues the happiness of those who work for mine, or something like that. In other words, he wants to make his slaves happy, to ameliorate them. These are the practical day-to-day strategies of making life bearable in any household domain. That is, keep the workers, keep the dependents, keep the family members happy. Of course, he doesn't like conflict. He wants things to run smoothly. And it's the extent to which people play their roles effectively within the patriarchal household that he can be convinced that he is a good patriarch doing his job. That notion is, it's not the same thing as what is his responsibility as an owner of slaves in a slave society over the long term. And he thinks about that, and he has his solutions, but he only lives in fear in moments in which he has good reasons to be full of fear. That is, in the midst of war, when those people he imagined to be happy slaves, contented members of his flourishing household, can be seen instead as internal enemies. So I think the first message is he's not neurotically torn, he's not anxious in the sense that we are. He's not taking meds for this. It doesn't mean he's not engaged with a larger problem, but I think that is probably represents our own obsession with our own psyches, projecting the therapeutic mentality of the late 20th whole 20th century and early 21st century onto another time. Jefferson knows that by birth and the inheritance, he has come into an extraordinary responsibility. And this is his immediate imperative, is to discharge this responsibility well. Then we can say, that's ridiculous. It's not a responsibility. You're participating in an immoral institution, an unjust institution. He says, yes, but. So make the distinction between living day to day in normal times and the kind of occasional spasms of existential fear that grip him when the future of the Republic seems to be at stake.
Can I just add one little thing to that? Just on this point, in the letter to St. George Tucker, which is all about Saint-Domingue and the Haitian Revolution, remember what he says is, if we don't do something, we will be murderers of our children. In other words, the injustice is not to the slave. He's not worried about, if we don't do this, God's going to punish, where's Ben? God's going to punish us. It's, we'll kill our children, the people whom we are responsible for. So his fears are grounded in that very household and those people that he's supposed to be watching over, right?
Could I give a much briefer attempt to answer your question, which is, I do not think that Jefferson rationalized himself out of believing that slavery was wrong.
Right.
He always believed that slavery was wrong.
You're here.
However, I think he rationalized himself out of the belief that anything could be done about it, or that he could do anything about it, unless one did everything about it. And since it was clear we couldn't do everything about it, he retreated from doing more or less nothing about it.
So can you sleep well now?
It's not, you know.
I'm gonna think about that.
On that question of doing everything, nothing or everything, I'm reminded of, that question's brought up in Uncle Tom's Cabin in the character of Augustine St. Clair. He can't do anything at all unless there's a state system that solves the whole problem. And of course, Stowe's answer to that is to ask the question, what can one man do? And Uncle Tom is the answer to that question. And she shows that it doesn't take heroic virtue. It takes being an American. Which is a very interesting response to Jefferson's dilemma, I think.
Thank you.
Who was up first? Okay, go ahead, sir.
I'm wondering a little bit about like the Southern prestige and Southern honor that accompanied slaveholding, and was wondering if that affected Jefferson's experience of being a slaveholder and his choice not to manumit his slaves, especially in his later years.
Anyone?
I don't think so. Again, I would be the one to say yes, this was a problem with the man. No, I don't think so, because I think he was so certain of his position. He never doubted that he was part of the gentry, that he was part of the patriarchy. That was just so much part of him. The idea that if somehow he got rid of his slaves, he would be less of a member of the gentry, I don't think that ever crossed his mind at all.
Right.
Joanne?
I think that's not necessarily true for Jefferson, but I do think overall, in a broader way, when you're talking about slaveholders, I think the question of their honor is bound up in all kinds of interesting ways. They very much, and slavery is an institution that's grounded on violence and mastery. So if you are a slaveholder, your honor, to a certain degree, is bound up with your status as a slaveholder. So I think, in a general kind of a way, for sure. There's an incident I write about in my most recent book in which someone stands up on the floor of Congress and says something really insulting about slavery in the South and is sort of threatening towards one of the Southerners in Congress, who then immediately responds by being violent, and he later says, well, if we didn't respond, they'd think we were all scared of our slaves. So we have to act a certain way as slaveholders. We have to uphold who we're supposed to be. So it's a good question because I think it's bound up in all kinds of interesting ways.
Annette?
Yeah, I think Joanne's right. I would pull Jefferson out of that. Certainly for other slaveholders that may have been a part, certainly as we're rolling towards the war. Jefferson didn't have the same understanding about honor as other people. As some other members of his gentry. His son-in-law was about to be involved in a duel, and for something that John Randolph, his distant cousin, had said about him, and he writes a really, really wonderful letter in which he talks about this, and he says, you're going to risk your life. You're going to leave your wife and children unprotected, because of something that another man said about you, that it's not worth. He said, once you become a married man, once you have children, your primary duty is to those people, not to answering other people's insults. So that's not, a lot of people didn't feel that way. His son-in-law didn't feel that way. He had to actually talk him out of that. And it's a completely different, it's a modern view. It's a view that we have today. The first things that people would think about is, well, what about my children? What about my wife? Can I leave them? He said, leave them unprotected in the world. That's a modern conception, but I think you're right. For a number of people, a thing called honor, a thing that they had to uphold, was definitely, slaveholding was definitely a part of that. But that, I don't get that impression from him, just thinking about how he thinks about honor in other ways in which people thought he had no honor because he would think that way about matters. He was a little bit different.
Before Peter goes, I want to get our final question in.
I was hoping to think about a topic you guys spoke about last session and bring it into this one, the idea of Hamilton's optimism of what good government structures could bring to a new nation and how that could help improve the general human mind and the human nature, and also the idea that slavery is inherently corruptive of both slaves and masters, and how we can reconcile the idea that they're trying to create this nation with government structures that are supposed to foster human improvement, while simultaneously upholding slavery that is inherently corruptive to the human mind and human nature. I don't know, maybe
Peter,
it might be too much, but.
You have 1 minute to whatever, or to that, and or the earlier question. That's.
Yeah. Well, I'll recur to Federalist 1, where he talks about this is the moment to act, because right now the people still care enough about the Union that that they're willing to they would be able to rise above themselves and do the right thing, because it's deeply engraved in their hearts. What he's really saying, and I emphasize the deeply, it's not the passing moment in which they say, hey, I've just been reading the news and I'm really upset, or I've been studying this and this is my mature opinion on something. No. A dedication to the Union, which is really a dedication to the American fragment of the British Empire, that's what's deeply, deeply engraved. We can then create the institutions which ultimately, to be legitimate, have to be predicated on the, well, call it the deep tacit consent of the people. They have to think it's their government. Well, since they are devoted to Union much more than the leaders of the various states who have their own selfish political careers at stake, because that's his big threat, and also the subdivision of the Confederacy into separate confederacies. All hell will break loose, but right now you have the people on the side of Union. And there's a memorable point, I think it's in Continentalists, where he talks about the problem is not with the people. The people are just like the kids, as the Who says, the kids are all right. The people are okay. The problem are the would-be leaders, the misleaders, the demagogues. This is the one moment you can sort of capture a sense that Hamilton recognizes that there are people out there whose feelings matter in some way. But it's the moment you must capture to create the institutions that will govern well, because his third comment that's relevant is good government generates attachment. And what we do not have in America is good government. When we have it, look out, because then everything's going to be fine. Then you won't have demagogues, you won't have the people being deluded the way they are. So I don't know if that's responsive to your question. I desperately wanted to be responsive. I was going to talk about honor, but that would be a dishonorable thing to do at this time.
Thank you, all panelists. And before I turn the floor over to Bob, tomorrow afternoon's session, there are no readings. So
yes.
If you have questions that you didn't get up and ask, feel free to bring those tomorrow afternoon to the final session. Bob?